If there's one thing you can do to avoid blowing your budget, to avoid delaying your schedule on your project, it's simply not doing a whole lot of extra work you didn't allow for. And that's why I'm going to go through 5 simple and effective strategies I've used on numerous projects to make sure that we were doing the work we originally planned to be doing and only the work we originally planned to do. So what exactly is scope creep? Simply defined, scope creep is doing more work than we originally planned to do when we developed our scope baseline. So in the planning phase, we go through, we collect requirements from stakeholders, we define the project scope. When it comes to project execution, if suddenly we find we're doing more work than we originally planned to do, that's scope creep. So for example, if our project is to build a new road and then through project execution, we find out we need to upgrade existing roads, we need to relocate utilities, we need to remove contaminated soil, and none of these items were allowed for in our schedule baseline, then we run into scope creep. We're doing more work than we originally said we were going to do. So why does scope creep matter? Well, put simply, our schedules and our budget for the project are going to be built off a fixed scope. If originally we said we were going to do 100 meters of trenching, then our budget is going to be built off this fixed amount of work, and the time we think it's going to take is going to be built off this fixed amount of work. If suddenly we have to do 150 meters of trenching, then our original budget and our original schedule isn't going to be sufficient. It's a very simple concept to understand. The more work we do, the longer it takes us, the more it costs us. So basically, avoiding doing extra work is one of the simplest things we can do to control our schedules and budgets. I've seen scope creep harm projects time and time again in my career. And I'm going to talk about a project from early on in my career when I was working on a rail signaling upgrade. As part of the works, we had new signaling infrastructure we were installing, but also situations where we had to connect to existing signaling infrastructure. When they developed the original project plan, they didn't have good information on the status of the existing signals, the conditions, and as we came to delivering the project, we suddenly found we had to do all these existing infrastructure upgrades to bring things up to standard, and it became a real nightmare. The first thing we need to do is to simply define scope properly. This is going to be the most effective strategy we have to manage scope on the project, and it's simply detailing exactly what we're going to be doing in the project. Our scope definition should consist of both the product scope, so what are the features and functions we're going to be delivering, and also the project scope. What's all the work we've budgeted for, all the work we've allowed for to deliver this product. The next thing we need to do is once we've defined project scope, we need to ensure everybody agrees on the scope we've defined. So in practice, on construction projects, this happens through contracts. We sign a contract with our client saying, this is the work we're going to be delivering. Here's the reference documents. Here's the design drawings. Here's the project specifications we're going to be following. So basically, through a contract, through some form of agreement, we need to articulate and define the scope exactly, and then make sure everybody agrees on it. The next thing we should do, once we've defined our scope properly and we've ensured everyone agrees on it, is we need to communicate effectively. We need to be referring back to this scope baseline and through project execution, articulating when scope changes, explaining why something is and isn't included in project scope. So communicating with all the different stakeholders, making sure everyone's up to date on both the project status and issues as they come up when things are and are not in project scope. And the next strategy, because we're communicating effectively and because we've defined scope properly and everyone's agreed on it to begin with, we can then manage change effectively. So when issues come up, when additional work gets requested of us, we can then go through a change management process. We've been asked to do additional work. It's not in the scope baseline. Here are the time and cost impacts. Do you want us to proceed with the change? That really comes down to putting in place an effective change management process, which is only possible if we've defined and agreed on scope to begin with. Then my final recommendation for avoiding scope creep is simply to document everything. So we document our scope baseline, we document our scopes defined to begin with, but then during project execution, we're documenting any changes to project scope, what's been agreed on, and we're keeping track of how the project scope is changing throughout the execution of the project. So what did we do wrong on this rail project? Well, the first thing we did is we just didn't define scope properly to begin with. Everybody knew we had to do some upgrades to existing signaling assets, but it wasn't clear exactly what we were going to be doing. We knew we had to connect to existing signals, but we didn't really clearly define exactly what we were going to be doing. Were we going to be upgrading the civil components? Were we going to be putting in new handrails around the signals? Were we going to be replacing signals? It really wasn't clearly defined to begin with, which then we entered this process of everyone talking about what would be done, people going and looking at site inspections and agreeing what was going to be happening. But again, while there was communication between different team members and agreements on what was going to be done, it wasn't communicated to the right people. It wasn't communicated to the people who controlled the schedules, budgets, and contracts. So all these little changes kept getting included in the project scope with no changes to the budget or schedule. So effectively, we weren't managing change properly. There was no adjustments to the scope baseline. And as a result, all this additional work was done without any additional money or time for the project. And finally, nothing was agreed to properly. It was all word of mouth. Nothing was documented. So if people weren't happy with the work that had been done, they had every right to turn around and potentially ask us to redo the work. So effectively, we didn't really do anything to manage scope creep effectively. So if there's one thing you take away from this video, it's that scope creep is one of the biggest problems on projects, and effective project scope management, clearly defining what is and isn't included in the project scope, and continuing to maintain this baseline through project delivery will prevent you doing a whole lot of unnecessary work you didn't budget for and ultimately save you time and money.